The wreckage still smoldered as Jackson Vale clawed his way out of the crushed cockpit, coughing against the acrid smoke billowing from his ship's ruined engines. His flight suit was torn, blood streaking his temple from the crash's violent impact. Every breath burned, and his limbs felt like lead, but survival instincts pushed him forward. He staggered into the dense, otherworldly forest surrounding the crash site, unfamiliar stars shimmering through the tangled canopy of glowing blue leaves. Lyrius, he'd only heard rumors about this forbidden planet. His mission had been a simple cargo run until something, possibly sabotage, yanked him out of hyperspace and sent him spiraling toward this isolated, untouchable world. No distress signal could pierce its strange atmospheric veil. He was alone. The ground trembled faintly beneath his boots as if the planet itself pulsed with life. Bioluminescent plants coiled lazily toward him, curious, their leaves shimmering like liquid moonlight. Jackson cursed under his breath, shaking his head. He needed to focus. Supplies first, shelter next. Before he could take another step, he felt it. A presence. Something or someone was watching him. From the shadows emerged a figure cloaked in flowing iridescent fabric that seemed spun from starlight. Her skin shimmered faintly like polished pearl, luminous in the dim light, while her deep, otherworldly eyes studied him with piercing curiosity. She was tall, willowy yet strong, her graceful features framed by long, cascading silver hair that sparkled like dew-kissed silk. Jackson reached instinctively for his survival blade, but she raised a slender hand, her palm glowing faintly with a soft, golden radiance. His weapon arm faltered, tension crackling in the charged air between them. "You are human," she spoke, her voice melodic yet alien, as though tasting the unfamiliar word. Her gaze lingered on his face, fascinated, as if she'd only ever read about his kind in forgotten tales. He gritted his teeth. "Yeah, human, and armed, in case you were wondering." Unfazed, she took a step closer, her expression shifting from curiosity to scientific interest. "You are injured," she observed, tilting her head as though analyzing his every movement. Before he could protest, she closed the distance, her fingertips brushing the gash along his temple. A wave of warmth spread through his skin, soothing the searing pain with impossible precision. Jackson inhaled sharply. Her touch sent a jolt through his nerves. Not just warmth but something deeper. An intimate sensation that tugged at emotions he thought long buried. "How did you?" he began, his voice rough with confusion. "I am Enya," she interrupted, her voice steady but tinged with something softer, almost vulnerable. "I study compatibility." Her gaze lowered briefly, something unreadable flickering in her luminous eyes. "You are the first human I have encountered in many cycles." He pulled back, uneasy but unable to break free from the strange gravity between them. "Look, I don't know what you want, but I'm not some lab rat." Her fingertips lingered just a moment longer than necessary, her touch feather-light yet charged with meaning. "Your species is remarkable," she murmured, as if speaking to herself. "Complex, emotional, intense." Jackson clenched his jaw. Her closeness was intoxicating, stirring something primal beneath his battered exterior. He should have been wary, defensive, but her touch drew out long-buried desires he couldn't suppress. "You've studied humans before?" he asked carefully, half afraid of the answer. Enya's lips curved faintly. Not quite a smile, more like fascination tempered by longing. "Not directly," she admitted. "Our records are incomplete. I was tasked with understanding what your kind values in connection, in bonding." His breath hitched. There was no mistaking the undertone in her words. Despite their clinical delivery, she wasn't just curious. She was seeking something she seemed to believe only he could provide. "You're serious," he muttered, half disbelieving. "I must know," she whispered, her gaze locking onto his, intense and unwavering. "What makes you feel?" Before he could respond, a distant, resonant hum rippled through the ground. A sound that felt alive, as though the planet itself stirred in response to their encounter. Her expression darkened, and for the first time, Jackson saw uncertainty in her otherworldly features. "We must leave this place," she said urgently, her voice steady despite the rising tension. "They will sense your presence soon." "Who?" he demanded. Enya's fingers entwined briefly with his, her touch sending another pulse of searing warmth through him. "Those who do not approve." Without further explanation, she pulled him deeper into the glowing forest, their path illuminated by faint, pulsing lights that seemed to respond to her very presence. Jackson's mind raced, torn between suspicion and something far more dangerous. A growing, undeniable connection he couldn't explain. And for the first time in years he felt truly impossibly alive. The forest whispered around them as Enya led Jackson deeper into its shimmering depths. Bioluminescent plants pulsed softly in response to her presence, lighting their path with an ethereal glow. Jackson kept his hand near his survival knife but couldn't shake the feeling that even the forest itself was aware. The sensation of being watched never faded, though it felt less threatening and more like being studied by unseen eyes. Enya's grip on his wrist remained firm but not forceful, her skin impossibly warm against his. She guided him with fluid grace, her steps making no sound on the soft, moss-like ground. Jackson, bruised and exhausted, stumbled after her, still reeling from everything that had happened since the crash. Finally, they reached a secluded clearing surrounded by towering crystalline trees, whose branches sparkled like frozen starlight. In the center of the clearing stood an elegant structure, half natural, half technological. A fusion of organic curves and glowing energy veins humming faintly with life. Jackson pulled his hand free, breathing hard. "What is this place?" he demanded, scanning the strange, alien architecture. "Where the hell are you taking me?" Enya turned slowly, her expression unreadable, though something in her eyes softened. "This is a sanctuary. For now," she replied quietly. "They will not find you here." "Who's they?" he pressed, still on edge. "You keep talking like we're being hunted." She hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. "The elders, my people. They will not understand your presence, or what you mean to me." He narrowed his eyes. "What I mean to you, lady? I'm just trying to survive." Before he could finish, his knees buckled, his injuries finally catching up with him. Enya darted forward, catching him with surprising strength despite her delicate frame. He hissed as her arms wrapped around him, steadying him with practiced care. Her touch ignited that same warmth again, soothing but also electric. Every point of contact buzzed with a strange intensity that left him breathless. "You are hurt," she whispered, her voice dipping lower, almost tender. "I can help if you allow me." He nodded reluctantly, too worn down to argue. Enya guided him into the structure, where soft, luminescent moss-like material cushioned the floor. She gently eased him down and knelt beside him, her hands hovering just above his injured side. "What are you doing?" he asked warily. She met his gaze, her fingers grazing his temple where dried blood still stained his skin. "Healing," she whispered. Her fingertips glowed faintly as they brushed over his wounds, sending tingling warmth radiating through his body. The sharp ache in his ribs faded, replaced by a soothing, almost intimate heat that made his breath hitch. Her concentration never wavered, though her fingers lingered longer than necessary, tracing slow, deliberate lines over his skin. "You don't have technology for this?" he asked, his voice rough. "We are the technology," she replied softly. "We heal through connection, through touch." Jackson couldn't suppress a shiver as her hands skimmed his chest, her warmth chasing away the lingering chill of fear and pain. He was used to fighting, surviving, but this was different. Her touch wasn't just mending his body. It was breaking down walls he'd built long ago. His fingers closed around her wrist, stopping her gentle exploration. "Why are you doing this?" he asked, searching her luminous eyes. "Why help me?" Enya's breath hitched just slightly under his touch. "You feel," she admitted, her voice trembling with something unspoken. Your kind is driven by emotion, by need. I have studied it, but never experienced it. Her gaze dropped to where his hand still held hers. Their fingers now barely intertwined, stretched between them. Until now, their breaths mingling in the faint glow of the sanctuary. Her eyes searched his face, questioning, almost hopeful. Jackson exhaled slowly, letting go of her wrist, but her hand stayed, resting gently on his chest, her touch grounding him in a way he couldn't explain. Despite himself, he found his fingers brushing against hers, exploring the strange softness of her skin. Their hands fit together with unsettling familiarity, like puzzle pieces meant to connect. He shook his head, trying to break the spell. Whatever this is, it's dangerous, he rasped. I know, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But some things cannot be stopped. Before he could respond, the structure shuddered faintly, as though reacting to their shared pulse. A sudden, distant hum echoed through the forest, low and resonant, like the planet itself was stirring. Enya stiffened, her expression shifting instantly from longing to alertness. They are searching, she said, rising fluidly to her feet. We do not have much time. Jackson forced himself up, his body still thrumming with lingering warmth from her touch. You said this place was safe. It was, she interrupted. But our connection has awakened something. He swore under his breath, already scanning the tree line for threats. Then we need a new plan. Enya's fingers brushed his arm again, grounding him for just a moment. Stay close, she said firmly, her eyes fierce with determination. I will not let them take you. Despite the urgency crackling in the air, her touch lingered, burning with a promise he couldn't ignore. And for the first time in years, Jackson found himself trusting someone, even if it might cost him everything. The air crackled with tension as Jackson and Enya moved swiftly through the bioluminescent forest, its shimmering light dimming as if responding to the rising danger. The ground pulsed faintly beneath their boots, echoing a distant, rhythmic hum. Something ancient, something aware. Whatever force governed this planet, it was stirring. Jackson kept his blade ready, his eyes scanning the twisted, glowing trees for signs of pursuit. The unnatural stillness gnawed at his instincts. Back in his military days, silence this deep meant only one thing: a trap. They'll find us soon, won't they? He asked, keeping his voice low. Enya's expression remained unreadable, but her eyes shimmered with something close to regret. The bond we created, it resonates through the forest. They will follow it. Your people, Jackson pressed. What do they want? To correct a mistake. Her voice faltered just slightly, as if admitting the truth hurt. You should not be here. We are forbidden to connect. His gaze narrowed. Connect how? She slowed, turning to face him, her luminous eyes searching his with quiet intensity. Your kind connects through emotion, through touch. We abandoned such vulnerability long ago. Her fingers brushed lightly against his hand, hesitant but deliberate. But when I touched you, something awakened. Her words tugged at something deep inside him, something he tried to forget. Connection. He'd spent years running from it, burying himself in missions and isolation. Yet now, her touch unraveled every layer he'd built around his heart. A sudden rustling echoed through the trees. They both tensed. The distant hum intensified, vibrating through the earth like a warning drumbeat. We have to keep moving, Jackson urged, though his voice softened. Whatever this is, we'll figure it out later. Enya nodded, her fingers lingering against his just a heartbeat longer before she turned and led him deeper into the forest. They wove through twisting paths, guided by fate, glowing roots that seemed to shift and realign with every step Enya took, almost as if the forest itself was helping them, until it wasn't. Suddenly, the ground beneath them rippled like liquid glass, forcing them apart. Jackson hit the ground hard, rolling to his feet, blade at the ready. Across the clearing, Enya rose gracefully, her glowing eyes wide with alarm. From the shadows emerged three figures clad in flowing, metallic robes that shimmered with cold, crystalline light. Their faces were sharp and emotionless, carved from the same alien beauty as Enya's, but devoid of warmth. Energy radiated from them in shimmering waves, distorting the air with oppressive force. The tallest of the three stepped forward, voice cold and resonant. Enya of the Lyrian Nexus, you have violated our most sacred law. Enya held her ground, her chin lifted defiantly. The law is flawed. You bonded with the outsider. The figure hissed, eyes flashing with icy brilliance. Such unions are forbidden. Jackson shifted his stance, ready for a fight. She didn't bond with anyone, he growled. We're just trying to survive. The figure's piercing gaze settled on him, as though dissecting his very existence. You are irrelevant, human. You will be corrected. Jackson barely had time to react before the air crackled with blinding light. He dove to the side, narrowly avoiding a surge of energy that scorched the ground where he'd been standing. Before he could rise, Enya thrust her hands outward, her fingers shimmering with golden energy. An unseen force rippled through the air, colliding with the advancing figures and forcing them back a few steps. Run! She shouted, her voice fierce and commanding. But Jackson didn't run. Instead, he surged forward, using the momentary distraction to close the distance between himself and the nearest figure. His blade connected with their shimmering armor, sending a jarring vibration through his arm but drawing no blood, if they even bled. The figure struck back with impossible speed, but Jackson twisted, narrowly avoiding the blow. His combat instincts kicked in, driving him into a brutal rhythm of strikes and dodges. He wasn't winning, but he was buying time. A sudden, searing pulse of energy erupted from Enya, throwing all three pursuers backward with a thunderous crash. She staggered, breathless, her skin dimming slightly from the exertion. Jackson rushed to her side, gripping her shoulders to steady her. We need to go. Now. They will return. She gasped, her voice strained. They cannot be stopped. Then we make it harder for them. He tightened his grip, forcing her to meet his gaze. I'm not leaving you. Her breath hitched, her fingers brushing over his as if grounding herself in his touch. For a fleeting moment, the tension between them crackled like wildfire. Not fear, but something deeper, something neither of them could deny. Before she could speak, the ground trembled again, signaling the return of their enemies. Their time was up. With a determined nod, Enya guided him toward a nearby cavern entrance concealed by shimmering vines. They plunged into the cool darkness just as another surge of energy blasted the clearing behind them. Breathing hard, they pressed against the cavern wall, shadows wrapping around them like a protective cloak. For a long moment, neither spoke, their ragged breaths the only sound. Finally, Enya broke the silence. Why did you not run? Her voice was barely a whisper, tinged with both wonder and confusion. Jackson met her gaze, his fingers brushing a stray lock of silver hair from her face. I'm done running. Her breath trembled as his hand lingered, cupping her cheek with surprising tenderness. Their eyes locked, the charged air between them igniting with unspoken need, with everything they had fought to suppress. Slowly, tentatively, Enya's fingers traced the edge of his jaw, her touch feather-light yet burning with intensity. She leaned in, her lips just a breath away from his, her hesitation melting in the shared, undeniable pull. Before their lips could meet, a distant, resonant hum echoed through the cavern, vibrating through the stone walls like a distant heartbeat. Their enemies were still coming. Without another word, Jackson tightened his grip on her hand, determination burning in his eyes. We fight. Together. Enya nodded, her fear replaced by fierce resolve. And together, they vanished deeper into the unknown. The cavern stretched endlessly, its walls shimmering faintly with bioluminescent veins that pulsed like the lifeblood of the planet itself. A soft, cool breeze whispered through the tunnels, carrying the faint hum of pursuit from far behind. Jackson and Enya moved in near silence, their footfalls muffled by the mossy ground beneath them. Jackson's breathing was still ragged from their narrow escape, but his grip on Enya's hand never wavered. Her fingers tightened around his, grounding him with their shared warmth. Neither spoke, though the unspoken connection between them burned brighter with every step. At last, they reached a secluded chamber where the air felt still and safe, at least for the moment. A stream of faintly glowing water traced a delicate path across the cavern floor, casting soft light against the stone walls. Jackson lowered himself against the cavern wall with a weary exhale, resting his head back as he tried to steady his breathing. Enya knelt beside him, her expression unreadable but tinged with something softer. Concern, perhaps, though she seemed reluctant she murmured, her voice low and soothing. "I'm fine," he lied, wincing as he adjusted his injured shoulder. Enya's gaze lingered on him, her fingers hovering near the torn fabric of his sleeve. "Let me help," she insisted, her tone leaving no room for argument. He gave a reluctant nod, pulling off his tattered jacket to reveal the angry bruise darkening his shoulder. Enya's breath hitched slightly, though her touch remained steady as she brushed her fingertips over his injury. Her skin glowed faintly where they connected, sending soft waves of warmth through his battered body. "You shouldn't waste your strength on me," he said, though his voice was quieter now, almost vulnerable. "It's not wasted," she replied, her fingers tracing slow, deliberate paths across his skin. "Your kind heals differently. Through resilience, through touch." Her tone deepened, laced with something intimate. "Through connection." Jackson's breath hitched as her touch lingered, her fingers trailing down his arm with a tenderness that set his pulse racing. He caught her wrist gently, holding her still. "Enya." His voice was rough, strained, but not from pain. Her luminous eyes lifted to his, wide and searching. There was no misunderstanding the meaning in his gaze, no room for doubt. Her breath trembled, though she didn't pull away. "I have studied so much," she whispered, her voice unsteady. "But I never felt, not like this." Slowly, carefully, Jackson drew her hand to his chest, pressing her palm against the steady thrum of his heartbeat. "This is what it means to feel," he said, his voice low but sure. "It's real, if you want it." For a heartbeat, she was still caught between instinct and longing. Then, without another word, she leaned in, her lips brushing his in a tentative electric kiss. The world seemed to still around them, the faint hum of the planet fading into the background as their lips met. Her touch was soft, curious, yet charged with untamed intensity, as though discovering something precious for the first time. Jackson responded in kind, deepening the kiss, his hands settling at her waist as he pulled her closer. Enya gasped softly against his mouth, her fingers sliding into his hair, holding on like she feared he might disappear. The warmth between them grew, enveloping them in a cocoon of shared need and fragile trust. When they finally broke apart, breathless and shaken, Enya rested her forehead against his, her eyes shimmering with emotion. "I do not know what this makes us," she admitted, her voice trembling. "But I cannot let it end." Jackson cupped her face gently, his thumbs tracing the curve of her jaw. "Then it doesn't have to." Their moment of peace shattered as the cavern trembled faintly beneath them, a distant, familiar hum growing stronger. Enya stiffened, her gaze snapping toward the entrance. "They're coming," she whispered, fear darkening her features. Jackson rose instantly, tugging his blade from its sheath. "Then we stand together," he said firmly. Enya's hand brushed his, her touch lingering just long enough to remind him of what they were fighting for. Before either could move, a sudden pulse of blinding light erupted from the cavern's far entrance, forcing them back. The air crackled with raw energy as 3 Lyrian enforcers emerged, their crystalline armor gleaming coldly in the dim light. "You cannot run from fate," the tallest one intoned, his voice sharp as shattered glass. "The bond must be severed." Enya stepped protectively in front of Jackson, her hands glowing faintly with golden energy. "I will not let you take him." The enforcers surged forward, their movements impossibly fast. Jackson dodged the first strike, spinning to slash at the nearest figure. His blade connected but glanced harmlessly off their armor. A blinding pulse shot toward Enya, but she deflected it with a powerful surge of her own energy, forcing the assailants back, but not for long. "We can't win this," Jackson growled, blocking another attack with grim determination. "We can endure," Enya countered, her voice fierce with defiance. Before Jackson could respond, the ground beneath them trembled again. But this time it wasn't from the attackers. The cavern walls lit up with a sudden, radiant pulse, responding to something deeper, something awakened by their shared bond. The enforcers faltered, glancing around warily. Enya's eyes widened in sudden realization. The Nexus. It feels us. The crystalline veins along the walls pulsed with growing intensity, resonating with the same warmth that ignited whenever they touched. The forest itself seemed to respond, not just to them, but to what they had become together. The enforcers hesitated, sensing the shift in the air. But it was already too late. The cavern exploded in radiant, golden light, enveloping everything in its brilliant embrace. And in that moment, Jackson and Enya understood. Their bond was no longer just theirs. It was the planet's as well. The golden light pulsed like a living heartbeat, weaving through the cavern walls and illuminating every jagged edge with radiant intensity. The crystalline veins hummed with power, resonating in perfect harmony with the bond shared between Jackson and Enya. The Lyrian enforcers staggered back, disoriented by the sudden surge of energy beyond their control. Jackson held his breath, blade still raised, ready for the next attack. But none came. The enforcers seemed paralyzed, their gleaming armor dimming as if the planet itself resisted their presence. Enya's glowing hands remained outstretched, her gaze locked on the pulsing walls, wide with stunned realization. "They can't move," Jackson breathed, stepping cautiously toward her. What's happening?" Enya slowly lowered her hands, her shimmering eyes flickering between wonder and fear. "The Nexus, it has recognized us," she whispered. "Our connection awakened something within it." Before Jackson could respond, the tallest enforcer's voice shattered the fragile stillness. "Impossible," he hissed, his face twisted with disbelief. "The Nexus does not respond to emotion. It is beyond such weakness." His words held contempt, but there was something else beneath them, fear. A sudden, resonant hum swelled through the cavern, louder and deeper than before. The glowing veins surged with renewed brilliance, spreading like molten rivers across the walls and ceiling. It was no longer just a source of light, it was alive, aware in a way neither of them fully understood. "They're afraid of it," Jackson realized, tightening his grip on his blade. "Whatever this Nexus is, it's protecting us. They will not stop," Enya warned, her voice steady but strained. "The elders will send more. Then we need to figure out what this thing wants," Jackson said firmly, "before they send an army." Without another word, Enya stepped closer to the central vein glowing brightest among the cavern walls. The energy within pulsed like a living memory, shifting and swirling in patterns almost too intricate to comprehend. She extended her fingertips, hesitating for only a breath before pressing her hand against the crystalline surface. The moment she touched it, the light surged, enveloping her in a shimmering golden aura. Her breath caught as she felt the planet's consciousness brush against her mind. Not invasive, but curious, seeking. Jackson rushed toward her. "Enya, what's happening?" I can feel it," she gasped, her voice trembling with awe. "It knows us, feels everything." Before he could reach her, the cavern floor shifted beneath his feet, sending him stumbling back. A tendril of golden energy lashed out, curling gently around his wrist. Not hostile but firm, holding him in place. "Enya," he shouted again, his heart pounding. "I'm all right," she managed, though her voice was distant, almost entranced. "It's showing me memories, feelings." The light around her intensified, tracing intricate patterns across her skin like living tattoos. Her eyes shone brighter than ever, locked in an unspoken dialogue with the Nexus itself. "They built this to suppress connection," she whispered. To contain what they feared most, emotion, they severed themselves from it, cut themselves off from each other. Her voice broke with sudden grief, as though feeling the weight of centuries-long isolation. Jackson strained against the energy binding his wrist, driven by an overwhelming need to reach her. "Let her go," he growled, his voice raw with desperation. In response, the energy shifted, loosening its grip but not releasing him entirely. He felt its strange, probing curiosity, less a force and more a sentient will, testing his resolve. Summoning every ounce of willpower, Jackson surged forward, forcing the energy to relent. His hand closed around Inya's, breaking the otherworldly trance that held her captive. Her breath hitched sharply as her fingers curled instinctively around his, grounding her in the reality of his touch. The cavern stilled, its radiant glow dimming slightly as if acknowledging the bond between them. No longer just an anomaly, and fell in rapid, shallow breaths, her hand trembling in his. "It accepted us," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "We're connected now, to each other, and to this." Before either of them could process what that truly meant, a sharp, mechanical crack echoed from the cavern's entrance, followed by the unmistakable hum of approaching enforcers. "They're coming," Jackson warned, instinctively shifting in front of her, blade at the ready. But Inya gently pulled him back, her eyes now calm, fierce, yet serene. "We don't need to run," she said with quiet certainty. "Not anymore." The crystalline veins blazed to life once more, surging with renewed intensity as though responding directly to her will. The cavern itself seemed to breathe with her, bending to her command. "They severed themselves from emotion," she said softly, her gaze locking onto his with unwavering intensity. "But we are stronger because of it." Jackson exhaled slowly, lowering his blade but keeping it ready. "Then let's show them what they're afraid of." The ground trembled beneath their feet as the energy within the cavern rose like a tidal wave, alive with purpose. No longer just a passive force, but a weapon fueled by something far greater than power. It was fueled by them. The air vibrated with raw, electric tension as the cavern walls blazed with golden light, surging in rhythm with the bond between Jackson and Inya. The glowing veins spread like living rivers, reshaping the crystalline expanse into something fierce and unyielding, an extension of their will. For the first time, Jackson felt the planet's awareness pulsing through the air, thrumming in sync with his pounding heart. The sharp crack of armored boots echoed from the cavern entrance. The Lyrian enforcers emerged in perfect formation, cold and implacable, their crystalline armor shimmering like jagged ice under the cavern's blazing light. Their leader raised a hand, his expression etched with steely determination. "End this now," he commanded, his voice ringing with harsh authority. "Surrender, and we will show mercy." Inya stepped forward, her eyes glowing with fierce intensity. "There is no mercy in your world, only control." Her voice resonated with power, amplified by the Nexus itself. "You fear what you cannot suppress." The enforcers spread out, moving with fluid precision, their energy blades igniting in crackling arcs of searing white light. They advanced with lethal intent, their purpose clear: eliminate the bond they could not understand. Jackson shifted instinctively, placing himself between Inya and the advancing enforcers. His survival blade gleamed in the radiant light, a steel relic in a world of shimmering energy. But he knew how to fight. "We don't have to do this," he warned, voice steady despite the odds. "But if you push, we push back." The enforcers didn't slow. In a sudden, fluid motion, the first enforcer lunged. Jackson twisted, parrying the strike with brutal efficiency before driving his shoulder into his attacker's chest. Sparks erupted as their armor absorbed the impact, forcing the enforcer back, but only for a moment. Another blade sliced toward him from the side. Jackson pivoted, barely dodging the lethal arc, but the burning edge grazed his side, searing through fabric and skin. He bit back a cry, forcing himself to stay focused. Before the enforcer could press the attack, a blast of golden energy exploded from Inya's outstretched hand, slamming into their opponent with bone-rattling force. The enforcer crashed into the cavern wall with a deafening crack, crystalline armor splintering like shattered ice. Enya moved with fierce precision, her glowing hands weaving fluid arcs of burning light that struck with terrifying accuracy. She wasn't just fighting. She was commanding the Nexus itself, channeling its energy through her very being. But the enforcers adapted quickly, splitting into two groups to outflank them. One surged toward Enya while the others cornered Jackson with ruthless efficiency. His blade met theirs in a brutal clash of steel and searing energy. Every strike rattled his bones, forcing him back step by step. He dodged another slash but couldn't avoid the second, which struck his forearm with searing heat. Pain flared through his body, but he held his ground. Behind him, Enya fought like a living force of nature, her movements fluid and precise, each pulse of power weaving through the cavern like a deadly symphony. Yet even with the Nexus amplifying her strength, the enforcers pressed relentlessly, their cold precision countering her raw intensity. Realizing they were being separated, Jackson pushed through the burning pain and charged toward Enya. He caught one enforcer off guard, driving his blade into the exposed joint of their armor. The enforcer collapsed with a distorted, mechanical hiss. Before he could reach her, a sudden blast of energy struck the ground between them, throwing him back with bone-jarring force. He hit the cavern floor hard, the wind knocked from his lungs. Enya gasped, momentarily stunned by the explosion. An enforcer seized the opening, surging toward her with a blade raised for the killing blow. "No!" Jackson roared, forcing himself to his feet despite the searing agony in his side. Time seemed to slow as the glowing veins in the cavern walls surged brighter, responding to his desperate will. Golden light erupted around him, forming a protective barrier just as the enforcer's blade came down. The blade struck the barrier with a deafening crack, shattering in a burst of molten shards. The enforcer reeled back, disarmed and stunned. Panting, Jackson staggered to his feet, his hands still glowing faintly from the energy that had shielded them. He didn't understand how, but the Nexus had responded to him. Enya's eyes widened with sudden realization. "It's ours," she whispered, wonder breaking through her exhaustion. "It answers both of us." Their shared gaze held for a heartbeat, an unspoken understanding, forged in the fire of survival. They were stronger together than they'd ever imagined. The remaining enforcers hesitated, sensing the shift in the battle. Their cold, calculating minds reeled at the impossible. The Nexus obeying beings driven by emotion, by connection. The cavern shuddered again, the pulsing light intensifying, as if feeding off their shared resolve. The enforcers faltered, but only for a moment. "We finished this," Jackson growled, stepping forward, his blade gleaming with renewed purpose. Enya's hands ignited with brilliant light, her power burning brighter than ever. Together, with a shared battle cry, they surged forward as one, unstoppable, unyielding. And for the first time, the enforcers knew fear. The cavern blazed with furious energy as Jackson and Enya charged together, their bond igniting the Nexus with burning intensity. Every pulse of golden light responded to their shared will, rippling through the crystalline walls like living fire. The Lyrian enforcers adjusted their formation with mechanical precision, coldly determined to complete their mission no matter the cost. Jackson moved like a storm, his survival blade a blur of steel against the crackling arcs of the enforcer's energy weapons. He deflected a lethal strike aimed for his head and drove his elbow into his attacker's chest, sending the enforcer staggering back. He pivoted smoothly, catching another opponent's blade with his own in a brutal clash of sparks and steel. Behind him, Enya was a force of nature. Each movement of her hands summoned radiant bursts of light, crackling with barely contained power. The Nexus surged with her, responding like an extension of her very soul. Golden arcs lashed out, striking the advancing enforcers and forcing them into retreat. But no matter how many they struck down, more seemed to emerge from the cavern's darkened edges. Breathing hard, Jackson spared a glance toward Enya, his heart pounding at the sight of her. She stood bathed in shimmering light, fierce and unyielding, Her luminous eyes locked with determination. Despite the overwhelming odds, she burned like a living flame, defiant, unbroken. An enforcer lunged at her from the side, weapon raised high, but Jackson was faster. With a fierce snarl, he hurled his blade across the cavern with deadly precision. The weapon struck true, embedding deep into the enforcer's armored chest, sending them crashing lifelessly to the ground. Enya gasped, her gaze snapping toward him. Jackson, he stumbled, clutching his wounded side, breath ragged but resolute. I'm fine, he growled, though the blood soaking his tattered shirt told a different story. We're not done yet. Before she could respond, the cavern walls trembled violently, sending shards of crystal crashing to the ground. The glowing veins dimmed, their once steady pulse growing erratic, as if straining under the weight of their desperate struggle. The lead enforcer stepped forward, his face twisted with cold fury. You cannot defy the Nexus forever, he hissed. It belongs to us. Your connection is, Enya spat, her voice fierce. The Nexus was never yours to control. It was meant to be shared. The enforcer's eyes burned with contempt. Fools, you do not understand its cost. Before either could react, the enforcer thrust his hands toward the cavern floor. Crystalline veins erupted in jagged arcs, splitting the ground between them. A deafening, resonant crack echoed as golden energy surged wildly, spiraling out of control. A sudden, unbearable pressure gripped Enya's chest, forcing her to her knees. The Nexus's raw power surged through her veins, searing with unrelenting intensity. Her connection to Jackson blazed like a firestorm, overwhelming, all-consuming. Jackson, she gasped, reaching toward him as agony ripped through her. He stumbled toward her, fighting through the deadly energy tearing at the air. His hands closed around hers, holding on with fierce determination despite the burning light that seared his skin. I'm here, he rasped, refusing to let go. The Nexus surged again, blindingly bright, as if responding to their shared desperation. But this time, it burned hotter, hungrier. Jackson's breath caught as realization dawned. It's consuming us, he whispered hoarsely. We're feeding it. Enya's eyes widened with horror. The Nexus wasn't made to connect. It was made to take. A surge of power exploded between them, sending both sprawling across the cavern floor. Pain lanced through Jackson's body as he struggled to rise, his breath shallow and labored. His gaze locked onto Enya, collapsed and unmoving, her luminous light dimming with each passing second. No, no, no. He crawled toward her, ignoring the burning ache in his limbs. The enforcer loomed above them, his expression cold and triumphant. Your bond was never meant to exist, he sneered. You will be erased, just like all who came before. Jackson's hands trembled as he cradled Enya's face, her breath shallow against his palm. Her light flickered faintly, on the verge of fading entirely. Stay with me, he whispered, voice breaking. Please. Her eyes fluttered open, glassy and unfocused. Jackson. It's too strong. No, his jaw clenched, tears burning in his eyes. I'm not losing you. Desperation twisted in his chest, pushing past reason and fear. He could feel the Nexus's relentless pull, but something deeper burned within him. Something it could never take. Love. Raw, fierce, unyielding. His connection to Enya was more than energy, more than fate. It was choice. With a guttural cry, he wrenched her closer, pressing his forehead against hers. You are not alone, he whispered fiercely. You'll never be alone. A sudden, blinding surge of golden light erupted from their joined hands, brighter than the cavern could contain. It surged not from the Nexus but from them, the shared, unbreakable force of two souls bound by something far greater than power. The cavern walls shattered under the intensity of the light, sending crystalline fragments cascading like falling stars. The enforcer staggered back, his expression twisted with shock and fury. No, this cannot be. But the Nexus no longer answered to him. It never had. The ground trembled violently as golden light enveloped the entire cavern, swallowing everything in its radiant embrace. The enforcers were consumed by the unstoppable surge, their cries drowned in the resounding pulse of something ancient and undeniable. And at the heart of it all, Jackson held Enya close, his lips brushing hers in a whisper-soft, desperate kiss. His final promise. Then there was only light. A deep, resonant stillness settled over the shattered cavern, broken only by the fading echoes of crystalline shards clattering to the ground. The once blinding golden light dimmed, leaving soft, shimmering trails etched into the walls like veins of molten memory. The Nexus pulsed gently now, no longer a force of domination but something calm, almost serene. Jackson stirred first, groaning as he pushed himself up from the cracked floor. His body ached from the battle, burns marking his arms where the Nexus's wild energy had seared his skin. He gasped, eyes frantically searching the ruined cavern until they found her, Enya, still cradled in his arms, her form bathed in the soft, lingering glow of the Nexus's fading power. No, no, Enya. His voice broke as he gently shook her, his fingers tracing her delicate face, now pale and still. The warmth of her touch, the spark of life he'd come to know, was it gone? His heart clenched as he cupped her face, his forehead resting against hers. Please, don't leave me, he whispered hoarsely, his breath trembling. I can't do this without you. A soft pulse of light flickered beneath his hands, faint but unmistakable. He froze, holding his breath as the warmth spread slowly, gently wrapping around her like a protective embrace. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then slowly sharpening as they met his. Jackson? Her voice was weak but real. Relief crashed over him like a tidal wave. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding, his hands trembling as he brushed a strand of silver hair from her face. I'm here. I'm right here. Enya exhaled slowly, her fingers grazing his hand as she leaned into his touch. I thought it consumed us. It almost did, he admitted, his voice still rough. But we fought back. Together. Their shared gaze held everything unsaid. The battles, the sacrifices, the desperate hope that had kept them alive. She slowly sat up with his help, her body still weak but steadily regaining strength. The cavern around them had transformed. What was once cold, jagged crystal now shimmered with soft, living light, warm and pulsing like the beat of a heart. No longer a cage, the Nexus had reshaped itself into something new, something alive. Enya's fingers traced the glowing veins etched into the cavern wall, her expression filled with quiet wonder. The Nexus, it's changed. It's ours, Jackson said firmly, his voice steady. It listened to us, not because it needed power, but because it felt something real. Before she could respond, a faint, distant hum echoed through the cavern's ruined entrance. Jackson tensed instinctively, pulling Enya behind him as his hand went to where his blade should have been. Lost in the battle. Emerging from the shadows came not enforcers, but several robed Lyrians, their expressions wary but not hostile. At their forefront stood an elder, his face lined with age but still radiating quiet authority. His luminous eyes flicked between Jackson and Enya, taking in the faint glow that still shimmered around them, the unmistakable mark of the Nexus's acceptance. The connection is still intact, the elder murmured, almost in awe. You survived, and it chose you. Jackson stepped forward, shoulders squared. We didn't ask for this, he said sharply, but we fought for it. We earned it. Enya rose beside him, her voice calm but resolute. You severed yourselves from what made you strong, from what made you feel. You feared it, controlled it. Her gaze softened, though it still burned with conviction. But connection is not weakness. The elder regarded them in silence for a long moment, his expression unreadable. The Nexus was meant to be a weapon, he admitted quietly, a force of order, free from emotion's chaos. Jackson clenched his fists. That's why it turned on you, why it couldn't be controlled. But with you, the elder's voice faltered, as if unable to fully grasp the truth. It trusted. The cavern pulsed faintly, almost as if in agreement. After a long, tense silence, the elder finally lowered his head in a gesture of acknowledgement. You have done what we could not. The Nexus is yours. Its fate and ours are now intertwined. Jackson exchanged a glance with Enya, understanding the weight of what had just been granted. They hadn't just survived, they had changed everything. The elder's gaze softened ever so slightly. What will you do now? Enya turned toward Jackson, her expression quiet but sure. We build, she said softly. Together. For the first time, a faint smile touched the elder's stern features. Without another word, he gestured for his people to retreat, vanishing into the cavern's darkened corridors, leaving them alone in the still glowing sanctuary. Breathing deeply, Jackson took Enya's hands in his, holding them firmly, as though grounding himself in her warmth. Are you sure about this? She smiled gently, her fingers tightening around his. There's no turning back, she whispered. And I don't want to. Their foreheads touched, breath mingling as they allowed themselves this quiet, precious moment of peace. Finally free, the Nexus pulsed softly in rhythm with their joined hands. A living memory bound by something far greater than fate or power. Gently through the shimmering forests, rustling glowing leaves that sparkled like stars caught in a midnight breeze. The once cold, lifeless veins of the Nexus now pulsed with soft, golden light, spreading warmth through the planet's living roots. The world was no longer silent. It breathed, lived, and thrived. Jackson stood on a ridge overlooking the endless expanse of crystalline trees. The horizon bathed in the eternal twilight of Lyrius's twin moons. His fingers absent-mindedly traced the worn leather grip of his repaired survival blade strapped to his side. A relic of a life he'd left behind but couldn't entirely forget. Behind him, soft footsteps whispered through the moss-covered path. He turned just as Enya approached, her silvery hair catching the faint glow of the Nexus's ever-present light. Her long, flowing cloak shimmered faintly, woven from the same bioluminescent fabric her people once used for ceremonial rites, but now it symbolized something far different. You keep slipping away to stare at the horizon, she teased gently, stopping just close enough for her fingers to brush his. Are you thinking of leaving? Jackson's lips quirked in a faint smirk. Thought crossed my mind, but it didn't stick. Her hand lingered against his, a quiet touch filled with meaning. Good. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the distant sky where swirling auroras painted ribbons of color across the darkened expanse. It still felt surreal sometimes. Being here, together, after everything they'd fought through. Survival had felt impossible, and yet, they had endured. Enya's fingers gently intertwined with his, grounding him in the present. The council has sent word, she said softly. They are willing to listen. He exhaled slowly. That's a start. They fear change, she continued, but they can no longer deny what's happened here. The Nexus chose us, and through us it has changed them too. Jackson studied her, noting the quiet strength in her gaze, the fire that had never dimmed, even in the darkest moments. And you? He asked. Do you still believe? After everything? Her expression softened. I believe in us, she whispered, voice steady. Everything else, we'll build one step at a time. He cupped her face gently, his calloused fingers tracing the familiar curve of her jaw. We're not done fighting, are we? No, she admitted. But we fight together. Always. Her breath trembled as his thumb brushed her cheek, lingering just long enough to ignite that familiar spark. Their foreheads met, a shared warmth passing between them. Steady, unbreakable. No force, no ancient power, no distant council could ever take this from them. A sudden flare of light drew their attention. Across the valley, new lines of golden energy bloomed along the crystalline trees, extending toward the sky like glowing constellations. The Nexus was expanding, its reach growing, reshaping the planet into something entirely new. It's spreading, Enya murmured in awe, her voice filled with quiet reverence. Responding, evolving. Jackson watched the shimmering lights with cautious curiosity. What do you think it wants? Her gaze turned thoughtful, contemplative. To live, to feel, just like us. Before he could respond, a distant hum resonated through the ground. A familiar vibration, steady but no longer hostile. From the far edge of the forest emerged a small procession of Lyrians, their ceremonial robes faintly glowing with shared energy from the Nexus. At their forefront stood the same elder who had once led the charge against them. Jackson tensed, his hand instinctively brushing his blade. But Enya gently touched his arm, stilling him. It's all right. The elder stopped a respectful distance away, inclining his head with quiet reverence. The council has convened, he announced, his voice steady but free of its former arrogance. We seek understanding. Enya stepped forward, her shoulders squared with quiet strength. Then you've already begun to change. The elder's gaze lingered on the glowing veins etched faintly along her arms, living marks left by the Nexus itself. We were wrong about many things. He hesitated, struggling with words unspoken for generations. Perhaps there is a place for both. Jackson stepped beside Enya, his presence solid and unwavering. If you're serious about change, you'll have to let go of what you were. This isn't just about survival anymore. It's about living. For a long moment, the elder studied them both. Two lives impossibly intertwined, bound by something stronger than power or destiny. Finally, he nodded slowly. We are ready to learn. Without another word, he turned and led his people away, leaving them standing alone under the ever-changing sky. Jackson exhaled sharply, as if releasing a weight he hadn't realized he'd been carrying. He glanced down at Enya, finding her already watching him, her expression soft but determined. We've already started something we can't stop, she said quietly. Good, he replied. I'm done running. Her fingers brushed his, lingering, before sliding into his hand. Then let's see how far we can go together. The forest pulsed faintly in rhythm with their joined hands, the Nexus's golden light tracing new patterns across the horizon. No longer a weapon, but a living promise of all that could be. And as they walked toward the unknown, neither looked back. Their story was just beginning.